Right, today we are going to build a quad, in this case the Ummagawd Acrobrat frame, and this is it when it's finished with its 3D prints on. So all I'm going to do is walk you through step by step how I put this little guy together, and hopefully it will help someone out. It's not going to be hugely detailed. You're not going to see me do every solder joint. I just want to give someone an overview of how to put together this little quad. Really chuffed for it. I'll leave links in the description of the bits that I've used, and also bits that would be handy to have, which hex drivers etc you need, the soldering iron I've used. None of them will be affiliate links. They're just really there to help you. So enjoy the video. So this is going to be just a general quick-ish overview of how to put together an Acrobrat. So you can see the naked frame base plate below you. I've got obviously the side plates, and one of the local lads kindly printed me out a front bumper, a rear antenna mount with some antenna tubes for the axis, although in this case I'm using the lollipop at the moment. We've got some soft mounts stroke bottom protectors, so these sort of claws that stick out will basically stop the bits that I complained about in the first video from rubbing on the floor. And apart from that, the components that we're using are, we have the Cadex Turtle, we have a CL Racing F4 Mini, we have a generic 20 amp 4-in-1 ESC, which has 18 gauge wire and is using an XT30 connector. Not a huge fan of XT30s, they're too small and fiddly for me, but for the sake of this little quad, I thought I'd use one. What I might do if I find it too much faff is just change it to an XT60. And this little 4-in-1 ESC just uses a 6-pin connector, and you've got the black wire, which is ground, the red wire, which is positive, and then you've got motors 1, 2, 3 and 4, and they will just connect to the CL Racing F4 Mini. If you wanted to make your life easier, you could just use a flight controller that accepts this plug, but I wanted to try out the CL Racing F4 Mini just because it's a board it's a board which I like the bigger version of, the CL Racing F4, so I'm going to give that a whirl. We're going to be using an Free Sky XM Plus receiver, which is the receiver I always use, really small, doesn't have full telemetry, but I'm not a fan of Mataranas talking to me or giving me telemetry warnings etc. This guy will put RSSI on screen, and that's all I need. Other than that, we've got a few bits of heat shrink, various bits and bobs and spares and screws etc which came with the kit, and a few of which are my own, and various bits and bobs in that one. In terms of motors, I ummed and ahed with motors for quite a bit of time. I've settled on Armattan Titan Mini 3650 kV 1407s, and I've gone for these. Never used them before, so I don't know what they're like, but I've gone for these because they're exceptionally light, and unlike a lot of people, I didn't want to use 4000 kV or 4100 kV because for me this is a freestyle quad. I don't need it to be ball breaking fast, I just need it to be relatively powerful in the bottom end. And on this particular setup, I think I'll get more throttle resolution at the bottom end by using 3600 kV than I would do if I was running 4100 kV etc. But as I said, these motors are completely new to me, so they might be rubbish, or they might be really good. So all I've been doing is basically just playing around with how this is going to go together. There's a fair bit of stuff to fit in a very small area, so in this particular case I'm using the blue bushings on the top plate. I've got no idea if they're going to be too hard or too soft. I did initially put the red ones in, which are a little bit softer, but I've just changed my mind. My reasoning being is I'm going to start off with a relatively hard one and then just drop down to a softer bushing from the options that we've got, if needs be, if I get jello in the feed. So as I said, all I've been doing is really playing around with how this is going to work. I fancy, if I put this side plate on, maybe it'll be easier for you to see. If I just shove this in. Oh, wrong way around. So obviously that's the front of the quad here, and I've temporarily just put the board for the Cadex Turtle up front. And my idea is basically to attach the 4-in-1 ESC if I can here, and have the battery lead just poking up out the front, out of the way of any of this at the back. It's very tight in terms of it touching the board for the Cadex, but right now it looks like it's going to be okay. In terms of how I'm mounting these little guys, the kit comes with obviously these little soft mounts. I've chosen the red ones. I've used the 10mm M2 bolts which are provided in the kit just to run up and through, and I've just used a nylon hex nut to hold it in place. Along the bottom you'll notice that I've ran some insulation tape, and the reason for that is because we're mounting this little guy so low to the actual frame, I don't want in a bad crash any of these components touching the naked carbon and scratching it and thus ending up shorting out. So I've just put that as a little bit of peace of mind in there. The run cam, should I say the run cam? The Cadex is up front, and the quirk of the Cadex is you can only use 3 of its mounting places. So all I've done is use some M2 bolts again. I think these ones are 12 or 14mm, and I've just put a couple of soft mounts beneath it. And again here, this side I can't use the mount because this is the mount which is off-centered. So all I'm going to do towards the end is just put some double-sided insulation tape to stop this side moving down so much. And then at the back, I did want to use one of the AKK VTXs or possibly the Eachine VTX that I used the other day. However, sadly, the antenna mount that I printed out, or should I say one of the local lads printed out for me, I couldn't get the MMCX connector through it, so I've had to switch it to a UFL connector, and the only UFL connector VTX that I've got to hand is a TBS Unify, so that's what will be going in there. Other than that, it's now just a case of putting it all together and making sense of it. So what I'm going to do is move to the next part of this video, and then I'll continue onwards. So what I've done is I've just quickly attached the turtle camera to one side of this. It's not where it's going to go, but it'll stop it dangling around. I've stuck a little bit of foam tape just under this corner of the turtle board, and I've attached standoffs, or spacers should I say, to hold in the 4-in-1 ESC. And you'll notice that these spacers have little gold things around them, and basically that is because the CL Racing F4 Mini takes M2.5 or M3 screws, and the screws we're using here are M2. So these little gold bits come with a CL Racing F4, and they basically just screw over the top of the M2 standoffs to create an M3 head, which then allows this to snugly fit over. Now what you tend to find when you're using these little standoffs is they're quite often not the right size. You tend to get a sort of pack of them like this, and you end up with tons of these really big ones that you don't need, and you always run out of the little ones. So all I've done in my case is just taken one of the big ones, use a craft knife just to shorten it off, and then just simply filed away the excess, just to give me the perfect amount of height that I need. And when I'm talking about height, one of the issues, or not an issue, but one of the things to be careful of on this particular frame is because the top plates, or should I say the side plates, are held in by these bushings, there's by nature a little bit of flex in them. So you really need to be careful that you don't make your stack too close to this side plate, because in a bad crash you don't want your stack being pushed down and hitting your flight controller, or at worst case, as I've already seen someone do, squashing the USB port. So I've designed mine that it's basically going to sit in upside down, if I can get it in, and it will basically sit like that with the flight controller upside down, and that way if it does squash down it's not going to touch anything. The other thing that I've done is I've just quickly attached the motors to the frame, and all I've basically done is just dropped a couple of M2 screws, or bolts if you prefer, into the motors. As usual, because I'm using soft mounts, the screws that come with the motors don't fit, they're not long enough, and the only ones I can find at the moment are way too long. Don't know if you can see that. They're too long, so all I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on with my build, and at the end I'm going to get the screws and just cut or file them shorter, just so they don't touch the windings. So that's it for this part. I've snipped the wires just a little bit shorter because they were ridiculously long, and off camera I've just been playing around with the idea of either using some of this blue mesh or possibly some red paracord, and you can just pull out the white inside and use the red outside. But I think, given the slenderness of this little guy, what I'm probably going to do is just use a length of heat shrink to protect these wires. Right, I've cut the wires even shorter to roughly the length I need to attach to the ESC, and I've simply slid a little bit of black heat shrink over the top. I'm not going to shrink it yet, it's already pretty snug. Right, before I go any farther, what I really need to do is decide how I'm going to power the Cadex and the TBS Unify. Now obviously the Unify can take direct voltage, and it can output 5 volts. I've been trying to find out what the Becs are rated for on this little guy, because it's got both 9 volt and 5 volt output. And on RC groups, there's one person claiming 1.2 amps, and there's somebody else complaining 800 milliamp. So I'm a little bit unsure as to how much draw this little guy will take. Now the Unify I need to power from either the 9 volt or LiPo, and the Cadex I can power from 5 volt all the way up to LiPo, but I'd like to power it from the filtered 9 volt output. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to wire the Unify straight to the wire the Unify and take direct LiPo voltage, probably straight from either the battery or the direct LiPo voltage input on the flight controller. So what I'm going to do now is just have a look and see how much room I've got to play with underneath, and double check I'm not going to need to attach any additional wiring before I solder these ESC wires on, which at that stage I won't be able to lift this guy up. As you can see, there's not a huge amount of space on the bottom of these 20 by 20 boards, so I'm going to have a play around with this, and then I'll make my decision as to how I'm going to power this. I just want to play safe and not blow the voltage regulator on this guy if somebody's feeding dodgy information. The other thing at this stage I need to think about is, do I want to add a capacitor? Now generally on 3-inch quads I don't bother. When you're running 1407s or 1306s and you've got a normal setup, there isn't a huge amount of voltage spikes running through a system like this, because you're running small batteries which aren't capable of huge voltages or anything like that, and the motors are pretty low amp draw. You know, in the air you'll be lucky to see 20 amps out of a 1407, so usually I wouldn't bother. But because in this case we're using the Turtle, I don't really want this guy exposed to anything nasty, so I think I'm just going to use a tiny 330 UF 25 volt capacitor, and that should be as much as I need. Now the best place to put this is straight into the LiPo, but because I haven't really got room to do with that, all I'm going to do is to attach a couple of wires, probably 18 gauge, and just wire it so the capacitor is kind of sat here, if that makes sense. So I've wired the capacitor directly to the battery terminals, so we've got plus and minus, and just connected it to the corresponding tabs at the bottom, or should I say pins on the bottom of the capacitor. With capacitors, when you get them, they tend to have really long wires or pins, and basically the shorter that you make these, the better your capacitor will work. However, if you attach your capacitor to 20 or 18 or 16 gauge wire, I tend to find that they still work exactly the same. So that's exactly what I've done here. I've used, in this case, 20 gauge wire. I would generally use at least 18, but again, because this isn't a high ampage or high voltage setup, 20 should be absolutely fine. The other decision I've made is with the TBS Unify, I am going to give it full voltage, and rather than picking up the direct LiPo voltage from the little ESC cable, I'm basically going to, onto the flight controller, I'm basically going to again attach this to the input, because I may as well get the cleanest source of power, which is here, as opposed to picking it up from the flight controller after it's been all the way through the ESC and into the flight controller. So what I'm going to do now is again just wire the positive and negative of the TBS, and all I've done is basically measure it up and work out how much I'll need with an extra half a centimetre or a centimetre. So I'll do that now. We now have everything we want. The Unify is soldered to the bottom of the battery terminals. The capacitor is soldered to the battery terminals. Obviously we've got our wiring here, so we are now good to go. So what I'll do is just put this back in place, attach it with these little standoffs with the gold M2 to M3 spacers on, and then we'll work from there. Right, the next part about this is we need to start thinking about this flight controller. Now, as I've said, I want to mount this upside down with with the USB port down, so it doesn't get damaged, as that's the highest point that sticks up on the board. Now, this particular board, all the pads are on the top, and on the reverse of it, you've got the sort of motor wire side, but at the front you're missing the camera, etc. Wires. So what I'm going to have to do is solder my 9 volt and camera signal, ground, etc. to this board, and then flip it over, and on the back I can do the same with the VTX and the smart audio wire, or I can choose to do it on the top. And of course I've also got to solder on the motor signal wires as well. So the way I'll probably do this is I'll probably flip the board so it's kind of like that. I will take the signal wires and the power and solder like that, and then I'll lift it up, solder the front, and then solder the back. So it's a little bit of a pain, but I'd rather spend an extra 5 minutes faffing now than have this USB port broken in a crash. Right, so I've taken the connector off the other side of the 4-in-1 ESC, and what I'm going to do now I'm all ready to solder the flight controller, is basically just attach these motor wires onto the 4-in-1 ESC. ESCs are, or should I say, motor wires are wired in. I've checked to make sure I haven't made any serious issues. Obviously I haven't connected anything to the flight controller yet, but I just need to be careful of these wires, which are, or should I say this wire, the red one, which is the positive wire, and that's going to be putting out 14 volts, and the same again on the Unify side, this wire will be putting out 5 volts. So I just need for the next part these to be nowhere near anything else, and then what I'm going to do is just get my battery and make sure nothing blows up. Yep, so we heard the chimes, so that's all fine, nothing has blown up. So at this stage I can now move on to wiring the flight controller. And as I said, on this particular guy, at the front along here we've got camera control, camera signal, camera ground, 9 volt, we've got 5 volt, we've got various pads, and on the other side we've got the motor pads, which I think are 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll have to check the diagram. And again we've got the VTX outputs, etc., signal wire, and we've got TX4, which we'll be using with the Unify to give us smart audio, so we can change the VTX channels via the radio and the goggles. So as I said, all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to attach the power wire and the ESC signal wires, and then we'll move on to the other bits. So I've wired the motor wires and the power and ground wire. So the motor wires are orange is 4, blue is 3, yellow is 2, and 1 is green, and then we've got the red and the black wire, which are positive and negative. So that's the flight controller and the ESCs all wired up. So all we really need to do now is just flip it over, put it onto its little grommets, and then we shall start looking at the next part of this build, which will be basically wiring up the Cadex Turtle and the TBS Unify. That's the Cadex wired in. So we've got the yellow wire, which is the video in. We've got the red wire, which is going to the camera power, and we've got the black wire that is going to the negative pad. And this particular pad here is giving 9 volts out, which is a nice voltage and is pretty much where I want this to be. Usually when we'd be using the TBS Unify, we'd be using the Unify itself to give 5 volt to the camera. But in this case, because obviously we're using a board with HD and all the rest of it, I'd rather give it 9 volt just to be a little bit safer and make sure we're not going to have any brownouts or anything like that under voltage, where maybe the TBS drops down to 4.6 volts or something, and this guy dies a death. I'm sure it wouldn't do, but I just prefer to play safe, and because these 9 volt pads are here, we might as well use them. Now it's getting quite busy under here now, so when I'm going to wire in, or should I say now I'm going to wire in the Unify, I'll probably just wire onto the top of the board just to make my life easier and not have too much bunching below. So we'll do that now. Just as I'm doing this, I've had a slight change of plan. I was planning on powering my little XM receiver from the TBS Unify, but instead I'm just going to power it straight from the board, which is filtered. So I'm just going to take out the red wire from the VTX because I no longer need that. I still need the black wire because both the camera and VTX need to share a common ground on the Omnibus F4 type boards with the OSD, because if you don't, what will happen is either you'll get no on-screen display or your battery voltage will flicker, etc. So you always need to make sure that there's a ground wire coming from your VTX and your camera to your flight controller. So that's the VTX signal, which is the yellow, black, which is the ground, and white is to TX4, which is the smart audio. At the front, by the way, on this board there is camera control. I haven't used it because I've got no idea whether the Cadex can use that function. I suspect it can't, and even on a normal Cadex camera, the SDR1, it was a bit of a faff to get camera control to work, so I'm just going to ignore that. It's no big issue just to plug in every now and again. Right, at this stage, before I go any further, I need to make sure that all of this is working. It's pretty much all powered up by a few bits and bobs, buzzers, etc. if I want to add those on. So really I just need to make sure that the thing works. So all I'm going to do is just get some 3M foam tape, cut a strip, stick it on the bottom of this Unify. Actually, I need another one there. I'm not happy with that. Let's get two. Stick another one on the bottom as well. It's covering that up as well. Then we're going to stick the Unify roughly into place, which is really as close up to there as we can get. And I've connected the antenna. The Unify can run for quite a long time without its antenna connected, but it's always good practice just to get into the habit of making sure your antenna is connected when you power up. That way you don't smoke a VTX. Only thing that's not in really at the moment is my receiver, but at this stage what I'm going to do is just get out my multimeter, turn it to continuity, and then just stick the prongs on here, and if both ways, and if we've got a short it will continually beep. Don't worry about the quick beep that it just did do. All that's really doing is the ESC's powering up, but basically if I had a major short it would just let me know. The fact I haven't, and the fact that I've double checked everything, means I should be good to power on. So this is always the scary moment, but let's see if it blows up. Right, so that's all fine. You can see the Unify flashing as it powers up. You can see the flight controller flashing underneath, and I can see a red glow coming from the Cadex board, so that's working as well. So what I want to do before I go any further is just get my goggles out and make sure everything seems to be okay. I've got a video, so I can go ahead and go to the next part, which will be wiring in my XM Plus receiver. This guy has already been, it's just come out my parts bin, so it's already been wired up, but essentially you've just got three little pads here. The yellow is the signal wire, the red is the voltage, and the black is the negative. And all I'm going to do is unplug this little connector, and then if you look here, the actual pads for this little guy are in the middle of this board. If you're wondering how I know all this, because the writing is so small, usually I wouldn't bother, but because I can't really see so well, I've just got the pin out which shows me exactly where everything goes. So camera control, camera signal, camera plus minus, satellite receiver, RX4 TX3, ground 5 volt, blah 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 blah, ground 5 volt S bus, and then you've got ground VBAT, which is where we powered it, current for if you run in a current sensor, which we're not, motors 1, 2, 3, 4, then we've got a VTX signal, VTX plus and minus, which is plus and minus power, TX4 which we're using, and you've just got another 5 volt pad. So it's a pretty simple layout. I've made it a little bit more difficult than it needed to be just by my insistence of running it upside down. But as I said, that's just me playing safe. There's no real reason to do so. I'm sure it'll be absolutely fine, but because I've seen someone with a squash USB port, I thought I'd be sensible for once. So I'm just going to solder this guy in now, and then we'll come back. So I've wired the XM Plus receiver. So you got the yellow, which is the S bus signal wire, red and black. And all I've simply done is stuck some 3M foam tape, a couple of layers, stuck the XM Plus on top, and then just sent a zip tie around just to keep it in place, so it's going nowhere. I've also added the antenna tubes to the back of this 3D print, and I thought I'd go for jazzy pink. The one thing I'm not hugely happy with is I'd like them to be a little bit further out. So what I'll probably do, sorry I'm off camera all the time here, is just heat them up a little bit and just bend them. Probably heated that one up a little bit too much. Just bend them out a little bit. Just so they're not blocked by the antenna mount. Do a little bit more on this one. Let's get it out. There. And they don't have to be perfect. I just want them out of the way of the bulk of this this antenna, and also it might help the video signal to not have these transmitting right in the same path. So that is pretty much it. What's left to do now is I need to finalize what bushing I'm going to use. Obviously stick the XM Plus receiver antennas through the antenna tubes. And if you're unsure how to flash this guy, I'd recommend looking at a channel called Project Blue Falcon, who's got tons of information on Tyranids, FOR Sky, Free Sky, flashing and all the rest of it. And it's a channel that if you're looking to build, you should really be familiar with. Sadly, the guy's passed away now, but in his heyday, he was an absolute force of nature, with really good ideas and knowledge to back it up as well. And I've just turned on my radio, and because this receiver is already from an X build, it should be already bound. Let's just power on and see. Yep, so we've got the green solid light, which basically means the receiver is all bound, so that's fine. Turn off my radio. Right, so all I've really got to do now is just attach the antenna to the TBS Unify and mount the camera, put it together, and then sort out these motor screws, and then we'll be done. And I just need to add on some M2 nuts to my flight controller, so I'll go ahead and do that now. I've just made a quick change to this. I've just taken off the zip tie which was holding the XM Plus receiver to the Unify, and I've just tucked the Unify antenna between the double-sided 3M foam tape and the receiver, and then just put a new zip tie around it, and that way it's holding in the antenna to the UFL connector snugly, and I didn't need to mess around with another zip tie. Right, these are what we're going to use to mount the camera. So we've got these little spacers that come in the kit because the side plates of the frame are wider than the camera. We've got an M2 screw, and we've got an M2 washer as well. So I'm just going to mount the camera now. So there we have her. She's all finished. So I've attached the antenna tubes, obviously run the antennas up and through. I've taken my bolts and just quickly filed them down a little bit so they don't come near the windings, and I've got these clear props on. These are the Azure 306R. They're probably way too steeply pitched for this little guy as a freestyle quad, but I'm just going to use these because they're clear until I get some lower pitch props. I'll probably try the HQ 3B3 and possibly my normal Dal 3056, and these little guys perform pretty similar to the Gemfan 3052, but they seem to last me a little bit longer, and they're also cheaper as well. So yeah, so there she is. Sweet little thing. Pretty happy with how she's turned out. I guess the interesting bit is going to be how much is she going to weigh with all this 3D stuff on her, because I forgot to weigh the 3D stuff actually, but it's got to be adding 9 or 10 grams I would imagine. I don't know, to be honest with you. So with props on, she's coming in at 184, and props off she was coming in at 176. And if I get my much less accurate scales, right, and get a 650 more battery, she comes in at 254 grams, which, to be honest with you, is lighter than I expected it to be. So basically, to get within the new threshold, even with all these 3D parts on, I need to save 4 grams, which is frankly nothing. Taking one of these 3D prints off would solve that problem, but all I'm probably going to do is just change the bolts on the side to titanium, and I will be at 250 grams on the nose. So yeah, so that is that. So the next part for me will be flashing this CL Racing F4 to Betaflight 3.5. Don't flash to 3.4 if 3.5 hasn't been released yet. 3.4 is a bit of a poor version of Betaflight in my opinion, and a lot of people have been suffering from hot motors. So if you don't want to, if Betaflight 3.5 hasn't been released yet when you watch this video, and you're not happy using a release candidate, then just flash to 3.33 and you'll have less issues. Don't know if I'm going to do a setup video for this, but if people really want one, I will do. So if that's something you want to see, then drop a comment below. Obviously at the moment the props are set up for reverse. Usually they would spin inwards, but I'm going to set them to reverse on Betaflight. I tend to have my props spinning in reverse during the summer months, but in winter when it's wet and horrible, I'll turn them to the normal direction, because the pro of doing it like this is you don't get as much crud on your camera lens. The downside if you have them like this in horrible British wet conditions is you blow all the crap which would have been hitting your lens into the stack. So I'll change mine over when it gets wet and horrible. But yeah, that's it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Any questions, give me a shout, but really looking forward to flying this little guy. I think he looks really cool. Cheers guys, thanks, bye bye.